So what's causing your carburetor to boil over with fuel, and why is it hard to start when it's hot? More importantly, how can it be corrected? So we're going to take a look at that today and some things you can do to keep your carburetor running right. Let's take a look at it. So what's causing these carburetors to boil over? It's heat, and it's ethanol. Ethanol is the biggest problem with today's carburation. Now, most vehicles today run on fuel injection. You don't have this issue because you're running at a higher pressure. Ethanol doesn't have near the issues that it does in an old analog, non-pressurized system like a carburetor is. When you bolt a carburetor directly to an intake manifold, you are putting it directly onto the heat source. The heat comes up from the combustion vent, out of the cylinder head, through the intake manifold, directly up into the carburetor, and that's where you're running into these problems. Ethanol boils at 180 degrees, and we've talked a lot about ethanol in the past in this carburetor series. Doesn't matter what brand of carburetor you have, you're going to run into these problems, and the solution for it is universal. It doesn't matter what brand of carburetor you're running. So we've got to isolate the heat from the cylinder head and the intake manifold to cure this problem, and that's what we're going to do here, and that's what I'm going to show you how to take care of today. Isolating the heat and trying to keep it as far away from the carburetor as possible. So this is a rubber composite material gasket, essentially, but it's a little thicker, that goes in between the intake manifold and the carburetor, and what it's designed to do is help isolate a little bit more of the heat. Breaks it up, helps it not transfer up into the carburetor, up into little fuel bowls that's in there. So just like any other little spacer, you know, the thicker you can get these, the better. Now, I think this is just a little over, quarter inch thick or so, but, you know, if you can run a half-inch spacer, run it. If you can run a 1-inch spacer, run it. If you can run a 2-inch spacer, run it. The better, the further away you can get the carburetor away from the intake manifold, the better. So that's what this is designed to do. It's very, very thin, and sometimes when you don't have a lot of room underneath the hood, these are the best little option. And here it is installed on the intake manifold. Again, it's not that thick, but it's enough to help keep the heat away from the carburetor. And then, like I said, you know, the thicker the spacer, the better. I know underhood clearance is tough on some vehicles. The A body is typically a half-inch spacer. You can get away with on a big block or a small block, and typically it just depends on how thick your air cleaner is. But again, anything you can do to isolate the heat from the carburetor, that's what these are designed to do. Now, I also want to talk about regulating the fuel a little bit with a fuel pressure regulator. Obviously, it has a job to send the right amount of pressurized fuel to the carburetor, but in this instance, and this is a non-regulated, or excuse me, a non-bypass regulator, so you just have to kind of, you know, imagine how this setup is. You've got one inlet, typically 2 outlets, and then one bypass outlet that goes back to the fuel tank. So the idea is that when the pressure or the fuel is not needed to the carburetor, it sends the fuel back to the tank, where theoretically it keeps it cooler. Now, there's a couple lines of thought here that if you've got at the drag strip and you've only got 2 or 3 gallons of gas in the tank, you're just circulating hot fuel back into a hot tank, and it doesn't have time to cool off. So that's one way of looking at it. If we go back to our fuel system that we've referenced a couple of times, I talked about this exclusively in the Ultimate Tuning Guide, but what you're really trying to do here is just keep the fuel moving within the system. And there's a decent line of thought there. You know, if you've got a mostly full tank of fuel, the fuel is probably cooler in the back of the car than it is closer to the hot engine bay. And by sending the fuel back that you're not using back to the tank where it stays hopefully a little cooler, I can see a benefit there. But it just all depends on the application. So those are two kind of ways that you can kind of help isolate the fuel from the hot intake manifold and keep it a little cooler. Now there's other things you can do. You can wrap the fuel lines. The Chevelle's got that done on. You can see here. You can route the fuel lines away from hot exhaust headers. turbocharger, or whatever the case may be. You can run one of those old school Moroso cool cans where it's kind of like a coffee can with a coil of fuel line in it, and you throw ice in there to help cool down the charge. That works, but it's kind of limited, more of a drag strip type of thing, like we just talked about a minute ago. But, the whole idea here is to help isolate the fuel. When you do that, those hot start issues go away very quickly because the ethanol, like we talked about, is not boiling in the bowls of that carburetor. So it makes it a really, really cost-effective, easy, simple way to just try to control the heat that's getting into that carburetor. So like I said, there's plenty of different, little tricks it can do, but your whole idea here is just to try to plan your way out. When you bolt that carburetor directly to the intake manifold, all that heat transfers directly into the carburetor. Aluminum transfers heat very well, and these aluminum-bodied carburetors suck up the heat very well out of the intake manifold. So you've got to find a way to isolate that. So I hope you found this useful. These hot summer days that we're experiencing right now, it's going to happen. You're going to run into these problems if you're running a carburetor directly onto the intake manifold. I know it might not look as good as you want to, but hey, when the hood's closed and you're driving down the road, you never see it anyway. So I appreciate y'all watching. Drop me a comment down below if you've experienced this before, some of the things you did to fix the problem. As always, if you thought the video was cool, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't. And we will catch you all in the next video. Thanks, guys. See ya.